The tension in the air was palpable. The kind of tension that causes individuals to hunch in a bit closer, anxiously hoping to catch the next word. Courthouse doors swung open, and through them came Kody Brown, the man millions recognized from Sister Wives. His face was set in a stern expression. His jaw clenched, and his eyes bore the burden of years of internal and external struggles. He was not stepping onto a reality television set this time. There were no directors instructing him where to place his feet, no cameras refocusing the ideal shot for a confession. This was not that. This was actual. Cameras flashed outside of the courtroom down the hallway, as if shots, each flash freezing the moment he wished he had to conceal. Whispers hummed like electricity from one mouth to another. There were some who were reporters in hot pursuit of the next sensational headline, others who were followers who had been tracking his life for more than a decade, and a few because they wanted to know how this tale, a tale larger than television, was eventually going to turn out. The Brown family had lived under the spotlight for years. Their life had intrigued audiences globally. One man, 4 wives, and 18 children, attempting to live in unity as the world scrutinized their decisions. Individuals watched each week to witness their happiness, their arguments, and how they attempted to keep it all together. To some, they were a symbol of love and harmony. To others, they were controversy in the making. But now, it did not matter anymore. There was no smoothing out of the rough edges in editing, no narration to connect the scenes. What was unfolding in this courthouse was raw, unfiltered, and irrevocable. Kody's shoes clicked against the shiny floor as he moved deeper in. All eyes in the room were on him. He was always accustomed to attention, but this was something else. Previously, the limelight had been his platform, where he was the master of the narrative. But now, in this room, he was not the narrator. The judge would determine, lawyers would make their cases, and his wives, past and present, would tell truths that could no longer be concealed. He could sense the judgment of strangers, the fascination of admirers, and the silent resentment of those who had stood with him once. For years, Kody had told everyone that his family was strong, that their unity was solid. But in secret, cracks had opened wider and wider, until finally the foundation began to collapse. Christine was the first to leave, opting for her own happiness rather than a failing marriage. Janelle followed, her sense of independence more powerful than her need to continue clinging to something that wasn't going to last. Meri, his first wife, clung the longest, but even she eventually lost her place in his affections. That left only Robyn, the wife who had been thought by many to be his favorite from the start. But even with her at his side, Kody wasn't entering this courtroom as the self-assured patriarch he used to be. He was entering as a man who lost grip on the empire he created. And now the law had come in to determine what was left. The room fell silent as the hearing started. The air conditioner hummed quietly, but below that you could hear anxious shuffling, papers being shuffled, and an occasional cough way in the back. When the judge arrived, everyone stood up, and briefly Kody's gaze flickered to the wooden bench where justice would be meted out. He swallowed thickly. For all the times he had spoken of faith, family, and leadership, he was now in the very same vulnerable situation as anyone else appearing before a court. The man who had stood tall as the head of a plural marriage was now a mere name on a legal docket. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks, trying to capture every glance, every sigh, every whispered word between Kody and his attorney. They knew the world was hungry for this story. After all, the Browns had invited viewers into their homes for over a decade, sharing the details of their lives. And now that those lives had fallen apart, the audience wanted the final chapter. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was accountability, property division, custody issues, money problems, and a family's dirty laundry hung out there for the whole world to see. Kody sat at his table, his hands clutched tightly in front of him. He attempted to be calm, but his mind was frantic. He thought of the children, all 18 of them. How many of them were seeing this play out from where they were? How many would read headlines depicting him as a villain, as a failed father who couldn't keep his family intact? He wondered about Christine, steadfast and uncompromising, finally free of the shackles that had held her for years. He wondered about Janelle, pragmatic and unyielding, holding firm. He wondered about Meri, the one who'd experienced more heartache than anyone should. And then there was Robyn, still with him, still attempting to stand tall alongside him. But even she could not remove the hurt of what was unfolding here. The tension became more oppressive with every second. Lawyers described, evidence was laid out, and voices swelled and subsided, like waves crashing against the seashore. Kody heard his life torn apart, thread by thread. The cash, the house, the years his wives said they devoted to sacrifice. The decisions he made that they said destroyed the family. All spilling out in stark black and white legal language. The truth wasn't made up for TV. There were no subtle background music signals, no pity edits. Just hard, hurting facts spilling out. The gavel came down again, cutting off the gasps that rippled through the courtroom. Kody's heart thudded in his chest as he kept his eyes ahead of him. The murmurs outside the courthouse, the flash of lights, the non-stop din of public opinion. All this seemed to recede for a second, as he understood that all that he had created was at stake. It wasn't about the land or the money. He was battling for honor, for a legacy, for the ability to leave without being utterly destroyed. And yet, on a deep level, he knew that this was not something he could even win. Whatever the outcome was, the family he once shared his name with would never be complete again. The man who entered the courthouse as a 4-time husband, 18-time father, and face of plural love, would exit as something quite different. The rumors in the hallway rang louder, repeating the truth that everyone had been holding out for. This was no longer reality television. This was real life, and this was real consequence. And for Kody Brown, the surprise wasn't simply that he was in court. The true surprise was that the tale he had worked for years to keep under his control had slipped from his grasp entirely, and now it was all the rest of the world's. Kody Brown wasn't simply a man into a courthouse. He was a character millions of people believed they understood. For over 10 years, he'd been beamed into millions of living rooms around the nation, his life passing from episode to episode, season to season. To his audience, he was the golden-curled man, the smiling one, the husband who had somehow managed to juggle the love and lives of 4 very different women. He was the hub of the Brown family, the leader, the provider, and the one that seemed to keep everything together. But behind the limelight, there was another personality, one that the cameras didn't always pick up. And now, in this instant, that personality was being pushed into view. When Sister Wives initially aired, everyone was enthralled. The concept of plural marriage wasn't new, but it was controversial, even taboo for mainstream television. Kody presented himself to the world as a man who was very sure of his faith, a man who felt inspired to give up his life with one wife for the possibility of more. For some, it was uplifting, a vision of oneness, sacrifice, and spiritual commitment. For some, it was uncomfortable, a lifestyle they couldn't grasp or embrace. But no matter where individuals were, one thing was true: they couldn't help but watch. And at the helm of it all, always was Kody. He was charming, sometimes overbearing, sometimes infuriating, but always compelling. His wives tended to characterize him as passionate, as an individual who could make a room full of people come alive simply by entering it. But passion has a two-edged sword. When Kody was content, he made those around him feel as though they belonged to something very special. When he was furious or disillusioned, the burden of the emotion could smother anyone it came in contact with. And those highs and lows over the course of time weighed down on those closest to him. The man behind the lens was a lot more complex than the one audiences witnessed on TV. Off camera, Kody grappled with the same issues any father or husband would: money, arguing, parenting issues. But there was something larger at work, as well: the incessant weight of having to demonstrate to the world that his family earned money, that his way of life was legitimate, that his affection for his wives was equal and absolute. That pressure seeped in gradually, like cracks in glass, and soon it could not be denied. Christine was the one who first saw those cracks for what they were. She had devoted years to smiling for photographs, cooking meals for the children, and setting her own joys aside for the sake of the family. But beneath the smile lay hurt. She felt invisible, unheard, and not appreciated, particularly as Kody appeared to bond more with Robyn. When she finally left, it caused a shockwave, not only through the family, but through the millions of viewers who had followed her journey. It was more than a personal choice. It was a declaration that the life they'd created wasn't the picture-perfect narrative Kody had always hoped it would be. Janelle, down to earth and fiercely independent, did the same as Christine. She had always been the strong silent type in the family, the one who labored, budgeted, and kept everything going. But independence didn't mix with Kody's control need, and soon even she couldn't remain in a marriage where she didn't feel heard. Then came Meri, the original wife, the woman who was there from the start. She had suffered heartbreak after heartbreak, including a very painful catfishing scandal that rocked the very foundation of her relationship with Kody. For years, she struggled to cling on, even when it was apparent that Kody's heart was no longer in her. When she finally released him, it wasn't with rage, but with fatigue, a muted recognition that the marriage she had once loved was lost. Throughout all of this, Kody went on insisting that he was doing his best, that he wished to maintain the family unit. But his behavior otherwise told a different tale. His proximity to Robyn, the youngest of the wives and the only one remaining with him, became the cause of bitterness and resentment from the others. To most, it felt as though Kody had ceased being the husband of four, and instead was the husband of one. And while Robyn stood loyally by him, the rest of the family slowly drifted away, leaving Kody with the painful reality that the empire he had built was falling apart. Now in the courthouse, all of that history followed him like a shadow. The man who once stood proudly in front of TV cameras was now sitting quietly in a courtroom where charm and confidence meant nothing. The spotlight had turned. Rather than millions of people viewing his carefully constructed tale, he now stood before a judge, attorneys, and legal papers that presented the tale just as it unfolded: shattered marriages, financial conflicts, property wars, and the disintegration of a family that once proclaimed oneness. Kody fidgeted in his seat, his gaze on the judge. But in his mind, he was living the past 10 years. He recalled the early years, when the show was first on, and the family thought they were invincible. He recalled the road trips, the family meals, the crazy but happy kids running through the house. He recalled posing in front of cameras, proclaiming openly his love for all four wives. And he recalled how quickly pride gave way to defensiveness, how the queries on favoritism, money, and jealousy insidiously eroded the image he wanted to safeguard. The figure in the background was not a hero, but neither was he a villain. He was imperfect, very human, and ensnared in a complex array of decisions that had brought him to this place. The court was not concerned with the Kody Brown that fans argued over on social media. The court wanted facts, evidence, and closure. And as much as Kody wished to convince himself that he could still dictate the story, he couldn't. This was no longer a TV plot. It was his life exposed for strangers to analyze and determine. As the attorneys moved forward to make their arguments, Kody remained quiet, the burden of it all weighing him down. The husband who had once so confidently represented plural marriage now was simply another husband in court, battling to save what little of the life he had known. The limelight was gone, and in its stead a cold, unforgiving reality. The world no longer viewed him as the head of a large family, but as a man who had lost nearly all. The gavel came down with a harsh crack, and the room was silent instantly. The kind of silence that was not peaceful but oppressive, bearing down on all of the chests in the room. Kody Brown sat rigidly at the table, his lawyer by his side, and even though he attempted to appear serene, his eyes betrayed him. They moved, fidgeting, uneasy, as though he sensed that a single word expressed here would alter the path of his life forever. He had undergone interviews, confessions, and brawls before cameras, but this was not the same. Here, neither his charm, nor his long monologues counted, and the well-rehearsed persona he had nurtured for years no longer held any significance. What concerned everyone now were facts, the evidence and the truth which could no longer be concealed behind edited vignettes. Across the aisle, the tension was even more biting. The hushed exchanges in the gallery had already circulated. There had been a former wife who stood up, and this was not about sentiment alone. This was about property, money, and rights which had been denied for too long. What had begun years previously as a tale of love, religion, and a family living differently, had turned itself into something much more bitter. It wasn't about who loved whom anymore. It was about who owned who deserved whom, and who had been left behind in the fray. The judge hunched over, straightening papers, and called the first attorney to testify. The attorney's tone was calm, but the language was cutting. They referred to deals struck, vows ignored, money intermingled so inextricably that it seemed impossible to untangle them now, as if trying to separate two sets of roots grown together for generations. Each dollar made throughout the decades of production, each house purchased in Arizona, Utah, or Nevada, every joint bank account, every joint debt, it was all up for grabs now. Kody adjusted in his chair once more, his fingers clutching tighter. He detested this aspect, the breaking down of his life into figures and papers. To him, his tale was one of love, of beliefs, of something greater than finances. At least that's what he used to tell himself. But now, listening to his life distilled into spreadsheets and acts, he couldn't help but acknowledge that money had always stood at the center of their turmoil. Cameras had brought wealth, yes, but also enlarged issues. Where money ran freely, all could pretend it was for the benefit of the family. But when money quit running consistently, when accusatory thoughts of favoritism and bias arose, money was poison. Christine was mentioned first. Her attorney stood firm, raising her grievances with assurance. She had devoted years of her life, raised children, helped Kody, and placed her own aspirations on hold. Now she sought acknowledgement, not verbally, but in tangible forms. She sought what was equitable. Her portion of the houses, savings, investments. To her, this was not revenge. It was justice. She had walked out of the marriage because she was sick of being invisible. And she was certainly not going to leave the courtroom invisible too. And then there was Janelle. Her situation was different. She was practical, self-sufficient, and less emotional, but with equally strong demands. She reminded the court via her attorney that she had been the one carrying so much of the financial burden. While others leaned into family roles, Janelle often worked jobs, balanced budgets, and carried weight that was rarely acknowledged. She had built something of her own, and she wanted her share protected, untangled from the mess that came with being tied to Kody. Meri's presence was quieter, but her story carried its own weight. She was the first wife, the first one to believe in Kody, before the camera crew, before the popularity, before the cash. She had been the one to stay with him when others didn't. But for it, she had been set aside. Her marriage dwindled to nothing of what it used to be. Her attorney's voice was low, but firm, outlining the years of emotional commitment that had been rewarded with nothing. Meri wasn't calling for revenge, but she wasn't leaving without something after all she had suffered. Robyn sat beside Kody, looking around the room, her hands clasped in her lap. To others she was symbolic. She was the wife who remained, the favorite of Kody, the one accused of being the cause of the family's disintegration. She remained quiet, allowing her husband and his lawyer to speak for her. But silence was also a weapon. She was in a sense the symbol of what Kody was still clinging to, the final remnant of the family that hadn't completely dissolved. But even Robyn couldn't stem the wave of voices calling out against him in this courtroom. The children weren't present, but their names were mentioned too. 18 children, each with their own tale, each entangled in the collateral damage of decisions not made by them. Others had testified publicly on behalf of their mother, others on behalf of their father. But here, in court documents, they were little more than names linked to custody orders, support claims, and money matters. The courtroom was not interested in their emotions. It was interested in what was due, what was just, and what was lawful. Kody's attorney finally stood, and for an instant, the man who had loved most to speak most loved to speak once more. The attorney presented Kody as no villain, but as a man who'd tried, a man who'd worked, a man who'd borne an unsustainable load of providing for so many. He reminded the court of the years that Kody had spent juggling multiple homes, working tirelessly to support them, and constantly laboring under the pressure of public scrutiny. Failures? Oh yes, there were numerous ones. Greed? Betrayal? No, the defense cried. That wasn't so. Kody, they said, was just a man who had attempted to create something remarkable, and now was paying the price for it falling apart. But even as his lawyer testified, Kody sensed in his gut that the room wasn't entirely convinced. He sensed it in the glances thrown in his direction, in the tilt of the air whenever his name was mentioned. For years he had been the one dictating the narrative, determining what the cameras captured, how the story went. Now, strangers were narrating his story for him, and he had no say whatsoever. The gavel fell again, calling for a timeout, but the tension wasn't dissipated. Everyone in the room understood that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The war had begun. What came next would be protracted, ugly, and draining. But for Kody, it hit him like a tsunami. This wasn't about rescuing his family any longer. That boat had sailed. This was about survival. Financial, emotional, and reputational. And courtroom survival is a much tougher game than survival on television reality shows. One by one, their voices started ringing out in the courtroom. Voices that had once filled into living rooms with laughter, with arguments, with hushed conversations late at night, when the cameras were not rolling. These were not wives anymore. They were women who had framed their lives for a man who had guaranteed them love, togetherness, and a family that could stand anything. And now, here in this room, there were standing on either side of him, not as actresses in a television show, but as people calling out to be heard, calling out for their sacrifices to be recognized. Christine's was the first to pierce through. She wasn't angry in the way people expected her to be. She was steady, confident, the kind of calm that comes from finally stepping out of a storm you've lived in for too long. She spoke of the years she gave, the children she raised, the meals she cooked, and the countless times she put her own needs aside for the good of the family. She reminded the court that she had left not in spite, but out of necessity, that she had to take back her happiness before losing herself entirely. She had pleaded for years to be heard, to be valued, but when those pleas were ignored, she chose freedom. And now that she was standing here, she wasn't requesting pity. She was requesting fairness. She desired acknowledgement not in words but in something concrete, something that would validate her years were not in vain. What she said was heavy, and Kody felt it. He glared at her from the other side of the room, recalling the younger version of her, bright, optimistic, needful, somewhere during the journey, that had been extinguished. And now, the flame flickered in a new manner, with determination, with autonomy, with the ferocity of one who no longer required him. Then there was Janelle, where Christine's voice was full of warmth and heartache. Janelle's voice was utilitarian, cutting and concise. She wasn't there to cry, or dwell on what had been. She was there to correct matters. She had been the one working during all those years, keeping things afloat financially, making sacrifices so the family would survive. As other women gravitated towards nurturing roles, she was frequently away from home, paying the bills, and carrying the burden of a life that was hardly simple. Her voice did not shake. It sliced through the courtroom like a knife. She wasn't asking for more than her due, but she certainly wasn't going to take less. She reminded all of us that this was no longer about love. It was about equity, and equity meant responsibility. Her words were another blow to Kody, who had long taken a dependence on Janelle's practicality, even if he didn't always verbalize it. He knew on some level that she had borne more than her share of the burden. And now, listening to her speak so forcefully, he saw she was no longer the quiet enabler. She was a woman standing independently, not going to let anyone devalue what she had brought. Meri's turn came next, and the room seemed to soften as she stepped forward. She had been the first, the one who believed in him before there were cameras, before there was fame, before there was even the idea of sharing their story with the world. Her voice was quieter, but every word dripped with years of pain. She talked about loyalty, about how she remained by his side when everyone else had doubted him, about how she gave her heart unconditionally even as cracks began to show. She talked about betrayal as well, not merely in the form of his changing affections, but in the manner in which she'd been emotionally left behind, shrunk to a shadow of what she'd once been in his world. She did not talk of rage. Rather, she talked of loss, of lost years, of a love that had died while she struggled to rescue it. Her words hung suspended in the air like smoke, unforgiving. Even the judge shifted his weight, recognizing the gravity of what she brought. Kody closed his eyes for a moment, because he knew each word to be true. He had let her slip further and further away from him, And in that, he had made the woman who had been his partner a stranger. And then there was Robyn, sitting close to him, her hand resting in her lap as she listened to the others speak. She had been painted by many as the favorite, the one who disrupted the balance of the family, the one who took more than her share of his attention. There were some waiting impatiently in the courtroom for her to deliver her words, hoping she would stand up like the rest of them. But Robyn didn't give her words the same kind of passion. She spoke softly, firmly, near defensively. She reminded the court that she too had sacrificed, that she never meant to insert wedges between anyone, that her devotion to Kody wasn't manipulation but love. She maintained that she hadn't stolen him, that his decisions were his own to make, and that she had only ever desired the family to prosper. Her words didn't cut like Christine's, didn't strike like Janelle's, and didn't ache like Meri's, but they still mattered. They reminded everyone that no story is simple, that every perspective carries truth, even when truths clash. To Kody, her support was a lifeline, the last anchor in a storm where every other tether had broken away. But to the others, her words were yet another reminder of why they had left. The voices of the wives didn't merely ring out in the courtroom, they resonated through the walls and carried into the lives of all who watched. Fans who had been following the family for years had their tales reimagined. The cracks they'd long suspected were now irrefutable. The sacrifices, the betrayals, the favoritism, the isolation, all of it revealed, not in hushed tones at the close of an episode, but under oath. For Kody, sitting through it all as each wife testified, it was like living the past 10 years in fast forward. Every fight, every sobbing confession, every slamming door played out in his mind. He had always figured as long as he just kept going on, kept pushing, kept dictating the story, that he could keep everything together. But to hear their voices now, he saw it wasn't the silence that had killed his family. It was the words. Their words. His words. Words that constructed hope and words that tore it down. When the wives were done, the room was silent once more. But this silence was different from the first. This was a heavier silence, heavy with truths that could not be undone, with stories that could not be cut out. The wives had told their story, and by doing so they had changed the whole case. No longer was it a matter of property or funds. It was a matter of acknowledgement, justice, and dignity. And for Kody, it was a bitter reminder that regardless of what the court ruled, he had already lost something much bigger. He had lost the trust, love, and loyalty of the women who had once thought in him. Their voices had been heard not in harmony, but in a symphony of sorrow, and there was nothing now that he could ever say to mute them again. The children's names emerged gradually, as if ghosts were wandering into the courtroom. 18 of them, all bearing the burden of their parents' decisions, all swept up in a storm they never invited. Their faces didn't fill the room, but their absence was felt throughout. All the documents, all the arguments, all the assertions of who owed what to whom, and who owed it to whom, all revolved back to them somehow. They were the common strand that ran through everyone. Why this family had once struggled so much to remain intact, and now why their breakup was so complex. The courtroom was not designed for such tales of childhood. It was not constructed to hear children's laughter in Utah or Arizona backyards, or the commotion of family dinners when plates crashed and words overlapped. It was not constructed for birthdays, skinned knees, or the more subdued moments when a parent tucked a child into bed. Courtrooms translate all that into paper words. Custody arrangements, support checks, visitation privileges. But under the lawyer's jargon were real lives, young and adult, formed by the cracks in this family. Some of the kids were old enough now to have their own voices, their own opinions, their own frustrations that had poured out into the world years before this hearing. They had spoken on social media, in interviews, sometimes on the show itself. Some came to the defense of their mothers, stating they had been overlooked, underappreciated, and left to bear the emotional burden by themselves. Others stood up for Kody, arguing that he had attempted, that he had loved them the best way he could, that the world didn't get how complicated it was to navigate this many hearts simultaneously. But whatever side they had been inclined toward, one thing was certain, They were divided, as their parents were divided. The little children, too young to realize the entire significance of what they were experiencing, would remember this day years later and understand just how profoundly it had marked them. They were shielded from the words spoken in court, protected from the headlines. For now, but children always pick up on more than adults realize. They picked up on it when their mothers cried at night, when conversations became tense, when their fathers' visits dwindled. They picked up on the silences, the absences, the way their family no longer lived under one roof the way they once had. Christine's kids bore her resilience, but also her hurt. They had witnessed her giving all that she was to the marriage, just to leave when it was too much. Some of them supported her choice, witnessing the liberation it brought her, and the serenity that came with it. Others struggled with bewilderment, caught between loving their dad and comprehending why their mom had left. The court papers may have identified them as dependents or monikers keyed to financial obligations, but behind those names were children who had experienced one of the most public of family splittings in the era of reality television. Janelle's kids had their own wars. They had always looked up to their mother's independence, her capacity to persevere no matter how badly things seemed to get. But they also felt the pressure of being between two parents who no longer shared the same language of love. Some felt abandoned by Kody, angry that he didn't show up in the manner they required. Others held fast to visions of him trying, of him showing up when he was able. The courtroom didn't perceive that fight. It only saw numbers on a page, dates, agreements, obligations. But for the kids, it was never that simple. Meri's only child had lived through years of seeing their mother pushed aside, their bond with Kody strained and distant. They had watched as the woman who once seemed central to the family faded into the background, her role reduced to something more symbolic than real. That pain carried into their relationship with their father, leaving scars that couldn't be erased by apologies or financial settlements. In court, Meri's story was tied to her marriage, her contributions, her losses. But for her child, the story was about feeling the absence of a father who never seemed fully there. And then there were Robyn's children, some from her previous relationship, others she shared with Kody. To them, this was the family they knew. They had lived in the eye of the storm, in a world where their parents were trailed by cameras and every disagreement turned into a public dialogue. To them, Kody was more than just their father. He was their protector, the man who had stood up for their mother when others would not. Their devotion to him was great, but it put them at the center of an anguished rift. While other kids pulled away, Robyn's kids clung all the more tightly, putting tension between siblings who had once called each other family at an all-time high. These facts weren't heard by the courtroom in entirety. They didn't hear the late-night phone calls being slammed against the walls, the doors slamming, the prayers being whispered by children hoping that parents would reconcile. But those tales existed in the silence between each spoken word. When Christine's attorney spoke of property, you sensed the unspoken reminder that the house was not merely a structure. It was where children had been raised, where birthdays and anniversaries had been celebrated. When Janelle's financial sacrifices came up, you could sense the reminder that her sacrifices were not made for her but for the children who relied on her. When Meri's quiet strength came up, it had the reverberation of her child's isolation. And when Robyn's devotion was being defended, it was accompanied with the picture of her children still holding on to the family they didn't want to let go of. Kody sat there, listening, his jaw clenched, his eyes shooting around the room, his heart weighed down. Of all the things that were being destroyed in this room, to the marriages, the assets, the money set, it was the reference to the children that hurt him the most. He had always taken pride in being a father first, in building a big and loving family, in being the man who could get it all done. And yet, he was confronted with the reality that many of his children were feeling abandoned, hurt, or divided due to him. He wanted to protest, to complain that he had tried his best, that nobody knew how impossible it was to be present in 18 different lives equally. But he knew, deep inside, that their hurt wasn't perception. It was real, and it was his fault. The lawyers bickered back and forth, but the children were at the heart of everything. Each argument regarding property had to take into consideration who resided there. Each conversation regarding money had to take into consideration support and stability. Each assertion regarding rights had to balance the future of children who had already lost so much. And even as the adults in the room wrestled with fairness, the quiet reality was that no judgment could repair the years of broken relationships. For the children, this courtroom was merely a page in a book they had been born into, a book they had not selected. Some would be better for it, made stronger, more capable, determined not to do again what they had seen done. Others would take their resentment, anger, and distrust into their own lives. The court could divide assets, allocate duties, and pen orders, but it could not mend broken ties or recreate lost innocence. As the gavel came down again, marking the end of yet another session, the room's tension didn't relax. The adults packed up their papers, muttered with their lawyers, glared across the aisle, but out there somewhere, beyond those walls, were 18 children, some peeking from a distance, others still too young to comprehend, all of them eternally tied to the tale being played out within. They were the ones who would live with the aftermath long after the courtroom emptied, long after the headlines faded, long after the cameras stopped rolling. When it was finally his turn to speak, Kody rose from his chair slowly, his shoulders squared, but his movements heavy, as though the weight of the entire courtroom was pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, cast a fleeting glance at the judge, then let his eyes sweep the room. His wives, his past, his present, and his whole life were just feet away from him. And the silence that greeted him was oppressive after the rise. For the first time in years, there was no script, no producer, no camera angle to make him worse or better. There was only his words, his voice, and the truth he decided to share at that moment. He started reminding the court of the years he had devoted. His voice was firm at first, almost like a script, as he narrated the sacrifices he made to construct a family that was anything but ordinary. He had chosen this life, yes, but it was not easy. Maintaining 4 wives and 18 children was not only a challenge, but a daily uphill battle that took every last drop of his energy. He spoke of long days working to give, long nights attempting to be with the various households, and the constant stress of not allowing anyone to feel neglected. It had never been about money or power to him. It had been about love, about faith, about creating something holy in a world that never quite knew. He owned his errors, the lost moments, the fights, the favoritism some said had tainted the family. His voice broke when he talked about the children, about the birthdays he couldn't make it to, the milestones he occasionally missed, the times he didn't listen when he should have. He didn't attempt to portray himself as flawless. Rather, he attempted to remind all of him that he was human, a man torn between impossible decisions, attempting to do what he believed was right even when it didn't prove sufficient. As he talked, his gaze shifted from one woman to another. When his gaze fell on Christine, there was remorse, a grief that seemed to recognize the years spent believing she was invisible. When his eyes landed on Janelle, there was respect, an unspoken recognition of how much she had borne when he couldn't. With Meri, his eyes grew soft, and even though their love had since turned cold, the tie of common history still remained there. And with Robyn, his eyes were firm, relying on her loyalty, the sole anchor he still had with him. But this wasn't an exercise of emotion. It was an exercise of defense. His attorney had coached him for this, and he moved from intimate confessions to pragmatic appeals. He told them that he had never meant to hurt anyone, never aimed to take anyone's rights away. He described the difficulties of apportioning property in a family so big and intermarried as his. He drew attention to the money he had invested in houses, the compromises he had made to provide stability for his children, the manner in which he had balanced responsibilities that would have shattered countless other men. He contended that although his wives were entitled to equity, equity did not translate to destroying all he had built. There was fire in his voice now, a desperation that was not only from defending himself, but from defending the identity he had constructed over decades. He informed the court that he was regarded as greedy, selfish, controlling. But he was not that way. He was a man of principle, a man who believed in family, a man who had struggled to live by principles larger than himself. He had failed, yes, but failure did not obliterate effort, and mistakes did not obliterate the love he felt for his wives and children. The courtroom remained silent as he addressed it. Some of the faces sympathetic, others incredulous. Reporters hastened to write down his words, aware that each sentence would be front-page news. Each tear dissected, each flash of rage fueling public debate. Kody was well aware of this, and struggled to maintain his emotions in check, though there were times when his voice rose, jagged and hostile, betraying the pent-up anger seething below. When he talked about the show, his tone had a combination of pride and bitterness. He reminded the court that exposing their lives to cameras hadn't been for fame only. It had been a means of making a living, creating opportunity they never would have otherwise had. But he conceded that the cameras also made everything more difficult, amplified every fight, transformed every miscommunication into spectator sport. The family that once appeared as one against the rest had rather divided under its watch. He went back to the children again and again. He claimed that they were his heart, his reason for being, the reason he struggled so long to hold the family intact. He acknowledged that some of them resented him now. Some felt abandoned, but he stood by saying that he had never abandoned them in his heart. He pleaded with the court not to consider him a man who failed, but as a father who made every attempt. His failures, he claimed, were not indicatives of ill will, but of the impossibility of being all to all at once. When he had finished, his voice was hoarse, and he slumped back into his seat with a deep sigh. He leaned forward a little toward Robyn, who put her hand lightly over his. For an instant, the courtroom hung suspended, the people sitting there trying to take in the words they had just heard. To some, his words were a genuine defense, a bitter admission that proved his humanity. To others, it was too little, too late, words that could never cleanse years of hurt, favoritism, and shattered trust. The judge did not respond, at least not on the surface. The lawyers rustled papers, ready to push back with words, with witness testimony, with hard facts that stripped emotion bare. But to Kody, it was not about victory in the instant. It was about finally speaking his piece regarding what he believed had been under assumptions and accusations for years. He had not only defended himself against the charges at trial, but against the narrative that had characterized him for too long. And as the silence went on, the heaviness of his defense hung in the air. Whether or not it had influenced anyone, what was certain is that Kody had left himself exposed. No longer the confident patriarch on TV, no longer the unassailable leader of a huge family. He was merely a man, broken, emotional, desperate, attempting to justify himself in a world where justification mattered less than proof. And still, even in the depth of his humiliation, he couldn't escape the sense that his words had fallen through the cracks, that the people he had trusted most immediately lost faith in him. The court would render the decision, but in his own heart, Kody already knew the jury that truly mattered. He had lost his family well before he ever entered this room. The air in the courtroom was thick, the kind that presses you to feel as though each inhalation held the burden of 1,000 watchful eyes. The hours ticked by. Testimonies were given. Attorneys had sparred with cutting words, and Kody's defense hung in the air like the residue after flames. Everyone in the room sensed the end was imminent. The judge shuffled papers with practiced care, each page's sound as it turned ringing out to echo louder than footsteps on marble. This was not merely the end of a case. It was the unwinding of a family, and the verdict would slice deeper than any legal paper could quantify. The families sat taut, their lawyers whispering final reminders that there was nothing left to be said. Christine sat upright, her gaze ahead on the bench. She had left Kody months before, but today was not a day of leaving. It was a day of seeing it, a day of being seen, a day of knowing that all she had done had counted for something to the law. Janelle pushed forward from where she sat, her fingers intertwined, her jaw set. She had always been the practical one, the strong one, but now her strength was quantified not by endurance but by what she would gain or lose in this leadership. Meri kept her eyes cast down, perhaps preparing herself for disappointment, perhaps hoping for justice after all those years of being ignored. And Robyn sat nearest to Kody, hand still in his, the sole anchor he had remaining in a world of changing tides. The kids' names were not mentioned, but their existence existed in every aspect of the judge's records. 18 lives dictated by choices outside their power. 18 names attached to money matters, land issues, and psychological wounds. All the decisions that had been made here sounded more loudly because of them. The judge cleared his throat, and quiet descended like a curtain. Nobody shifted, not even the reporters, who had sat through the whole hearing scribbling away. It was one of those silences in which even the whir of the air conditioner appeared to disappear. The verdict was in. The voice was level, unruffled, but every word fell like a stone cast into quiet water, spreading ripples outward. Property was to be shared. The houses that once represented togetherness, constructed with joint aspirations and joint sacrifices, would no longer be the property of a single household. Christine was given absolute rights to the home she had struggled for, the home where she had invested her energy, the home she wished to pass on to her kids. Janelle, also, was given credit for her economic inputs, her name attached to assets that now represented her autonomy. Meri, whose claim was less secure, was allotted something that recognized her long years of devotion and the agony of her gradual removal. And then there were the tougher words, the ones concerning responsibilities. Kody, once the patriarch who had asserted dominance over them all, was now bound by law to provide in ways he no longer comprehensively commanded. Financial aid was mandated for certain children still reliant on their parents. Debts were split, duties defined with cutting precision. The judge spelled it out. This wasn't about punishing one and rewarding another. It was about balance, about fairness, about law slicing through years of knotted feelings. Kody remained motionless, his expression unmovable, although his eyes flashed with tempests. For a man who had once towered above as head of a large family, to be deprived of control in stark black and white words, was a blow that cut deeper than anyone could perceive. Christine closed her eyes for a moment, a tear running down her cheek. Not of sorrow but of relief. Janelle released a breath, her fingers relaxing as if she had held her breath for months and could finally exhale. Meri did not cry, but her mouth quivered, a silent admission that even in triumph scars existed. And Robyn, holding Kody's hand more tightly, gazed at him with fear, as if the verdict had just attested to the nightmare she feared. The pens of the reporters flew once more, documenting the decision in ink which would soon become headlines. Sister Wives Courtroom Shock. Kody Brown directed to separate assets. Verdict splits reality TV family forever. Outside, critics and fans alike would gorge on the decision, but inside, those who had lived this life tasted the biting sting of reality. The judge's last words weighed heavily over the room. This ruling gives effect to the division of assets and obligations in a fair manner, taking into account the contributions and circumstances of all parties. It does not decide personal grievances, nor can it mend fences. That is not within the jurisdiction of this court. And with that, the gavel came down, a loud crack in the silence like thunder. It was finished. The case had been closed, but the tale was hardly over. For Kody, the ruling was not just a legal defeat. It was the deconstruction of the identity he'd worn for nearly 3 decades. He'd been the patriarch, the leader, the man at the center of everything, and now the law had sundered the very cornerstone of that role. His wives had walked off with acknowledgement. His children had been recognized as dependents on whom he would continue to bestow his support, and he stood alone in the midst of a shattered legacy. The wives, gaining legal ground as they were, bore conflicted feelings. Christine won her triumph, but triumph came with the pain of all she had come through to achieve it. Janelle won independence, but independence brought a complete break of bonds she had come to value. Meri, though recognized, still bore the hollowness of years lost to love that had long since dried up. And Robyn, while yet again by the side of Kody, now carried the burden of being his sole partner, his final friend in a world where the rest had been released. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows on the steps. Cameras flashed as the Browns stepped out, but none of them smiled. Reporters yelled questions. Kody, isn't this unfair? Christine, how are you feeling now? Janelle, what will you do next? None of them replied, their silence greater than words. For the kids spread out over states and lives, the news would come in waves. Some would be relieved their mothers had been heard. Some would be angry their father had been pushed into compromise. And some would just be weary. Weary of being a part of a tale they never wanted to be a part of. Weary of seeing their family fall apart on television. The decision stunned not only the courtroom, but the world that watched them for more than a decade. There were hours online of fans arguing. Some with the wives, some defending Kody, others grieving the loss of what had appeared to be an invincible family tie. But behind all the noise of opinion, the reality was that the Brown family would never be the same. Behind the wheel of his car, out of sight of the cameras, Kody sat silently, his hands clutched the wheel hard, his knuckles white. Robyn rode alongside him, her eyes red from suppressed tears, her hand on his arm. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The jury had spoken louder than he ever could have. He wasn't merely walking out of it. He was departing the last remains of the family he had once believed would remain forever. The doors of the courthouse shut on them, but the shadows of the verdict lingered. For the Browns, the trial was done, but the repercussions were only just starting. Reporters milled on the steps. Fans murmured in shock. Critics shook their heads in expectation. It was the sort of conclusion that didn't quite seem like a conclusion at all, but more the beginning of something heavier. Something that none of them could ever quite prepare for. Kody moved woodenly, his face chiseled in stone, but underlying it his mind swirled like a hurricane. For years he had existed as the leader, the man who dictated the way of his family, but that facade had shattered before the eyes of all. The law had taken away from him. The power he had felt was unassailable and replaced it with obligation, responsibility, and an inescapable fact. His family was no longer his own. His wives were no longer held by allegiance. His children no longer protected beneath a single roof. They had been parted not just by feeling, but now by law. He could still hear the judge's words, resonating in his chest, as if every sentence had sliced a fresh scar. Christine, on the other hand, was surprised to find a strange peace. She had worn the disappointments for years, being invisible, donating endlessly without being noticed. The judgment was not for revenge. It was not even for money. It was about recognition. Proof that her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. That her voice finally mattered. As she stepped into the evening air, a tear slid down her cheek. But it wasn't sorrow. It was relief. The kind of relief that comes when chains you've worn for decades finally snap. She imagined her children, the role model she was providing, the fresh life she was starting beyond the shadow of Kody. Tonight she was walking home with something harder than property or paper. She was taking home freedom. Janelle's response was less vocal, but no less intense. Independence had always been her forte, and the verdict ensured that independence in a manner she could now believe in. No more doubts regarding what was hers. No more being ignored while others took over. Yet, there was a soreness in her heart. She hadn't wanted it to reach this point. She had once believed in the dream. Believed in Kody, believed in a family that could conquer anything. And now, she bore a bittersweet triumph. Aware that what she had won in court was at the expense of what she had long sought to preserve. Meri hung back, her face inscrutable. She had been displaced, long before the trial. Her romance with Kody, relegated to a bad memory. But as the judge recognized her years of marriage, she felt something awaken within her. Not happiness but vindication. For years, she had felt overlooked, as a ghost in her marriage, as a shadow of who she used to be. Then the court had called out her name, put weight to her tale, and although it could never cure the isolation, it provided her with something to stand on. She departed holding her head higher than in many a year, even though her heart retained scars. Robyn, however, gripped Kody's arm as if releasing it would be to drown. She had been there for him all along, through the breakdown of the family, through the departure of the other wives. She had had faith in him, when no one else had, stood up for him when everyone else had walked away. And yet, as she saw the others leaving with their triumphs, she tasted the bitter bite of reality. She hadn't lost the case, but she'd lost the unity that had made her marriage feel safe. She was stuck with Kody, sure, but also with the weight of being the sole carrier of his pain. Loyal at that moment seemed less like devotion, and more like captivity. And there were the children. Although they had not stood in that courtroom, they resided in its wake. Phones rang with texts, social media filled with posts, and the news came to them individually, as if ripples from a stone thrown into water, cheering for their mothers, pleased that their sacrifices were finally recognized, were some of the older children. Others were angry with their father's humiliation, offended that the man they once admired was now painted as defeated. Others remained silent, weary of being trapped in the middle of a tale they never wished to be involved in. For the youngest children, the verdict didn't compute yet, but it would. One day they would scan the headlines, see the clips, and understand how much this day had defined their family's destiny. The outside world was abuzz. Fans argued ceaselessly online, some praising Christine and Janelle as heroes, some demanding Kody had been villainized. Comment threads were filled with opinion, sympathy, outrage, and judgment. The Brown family was no longer merely a reality show spectacle. They were a case study, a cautionary tale of love and faith. And the price of decisions lived too out in the open. But within the family, the din of the world did not apply. What counted was the quiet that now came between them. The group texts that had united the children fell silent. The holidays that had united them splintered into smaller, fractured gatherings. Birthdays became complicated, with some kids taking sides, others not taking any side at all. The term family remained, but did not carry the same meaning as before. Kody felt the silence most of all. During the night, when the cameras disappeared, when Robyn had retired, he was left sitting alone with the burden of it. He replayed the verdict over in his mind, asking himself if he might have struggled more, done more, been different. He remembered the children who no longer called, the wives who no longer looked at him with love, the dream that had begun so full of faith, and was now in shambles. He wanted to blame the system, the world, even the cameras that had exposed their frailties. But in the silence, deep inside, he knew the truth. The biggest loss wasn't in the courtroom. It lay in the hearts of the ones he had once vowed to safeguard. Christine in her new house felt lighter. She brought her children together, prepared dinner, and laughed more easily than in years. For her, the aftermath was not an end, but a beginning. She had created a life beyond the marriage, and now she could walk into it without so much as a glance back. Janelle immersed herself in work, in plans, and forging her own future with the independence she had battled so fiercely to gain. Meri comforted herself in loneliness, gradually piecing together her sense of self, fragment by fragment. And Robyn, although still devoted, couldn't silence the churning fear that devotion by itself may not be sufficient to keep the fragments of what was left intact. The aftermath was rough, imperfect and bare, but it was true. It was the sort of finish that didn't wrap things up tidily, but instead saw everyone leaving with both a victory and a loss each. For the Browns there would be life, but never as they had known it. The ruling had ended one book and begun another, one in which the bonds of marriage and family were not defined by religion or custom, but by choice, by necessity, and by the wounds of what had been. And so, while the rest of the world turned the page on the next big story, the Browns were left with their truth. A family once together under one name, one faith, one hope, now dispersed into different lives, different homes, different tales. The court had ruled, but the resonance of that decision would haunt them forever, tinting how they lived, how they loved, and how they recalled the days when they were still, despite all odds, one.